Well, today we're going to break down the psychology and the biology of attraction, pulling directly from the research to uncover some of the hidden forces at play.
Okay, so how does this all work? We're going to walk through 6 really fascinating lessons. We'll kick things off with some psychology, stuff like the scarcity principle. You've probably seen it in marketing.
All right, first up, let's talk about the scarcity principle. Now, you might have heard this in an economics class, but as the source material shows, it applies just as powerfully to human connection.
The whole idea here, which comes from psychologist Dr. Robert Cialdini, is actually pretty simple. We just seem to place a higher value on things that are rare or are hard to get. Think about limited edition sneakers or a one-night-only event. The source argues this same exact logic applies to people.
And this is where it gets really interesting. The source uses this classic dating stereotype to make the point. You've got the person who's always available, always texting back immediately. But then you've got the person who seems to have a lot going on. Their attention is divided. Suddenly their attention becomes a scarce resource, and according to this principle, it seems more valuable. Now, this isn't about playing games. It's about understanding the basic psychology of availability.
So how do you actually apply this? Well, the source gives us this party scenario. It's a 4-step guide. You see the person, you walk past them, you make a little bit of eye contact and say hi, and then you keep walking and talk to someone else. See? You're not just hovering. You make a brief, confident connection and then you move on. Okay, so building on that idea of creating value, our second lesson, the gain-loss theory, looks at something that might be even more powerful, the thrill of actually winning someone over. The source points to this really clever study. You had college students who thought they were just in a meeting, but afterwards they were set up to accidentally overhear the person running the experiment talking about them. And of course, what they heard was totally manipulated. It was either all positive, all negative, or it changed from one to the other. And check out these results. I mean, they're fascinating. Sure, people like the experimenter who is positive the whole time. That makes sense. But who did they like the most? The one whose opinions started out negative and then became positive. And you have to ask why. Well, it feels like an achievement. We value that good opinion more because we feel like we earned it. It's this incredibly powerful psychological reward. So we've talked about making your attention scarce. But here comes a twist. Our third lesson makes this really important distinction. You actually need to be physically near the person you're interested in. This number, 41%, it comes from a famous study at MIT. Researchers were looking at how friendships formed in a dorm, and they found that students had a 41% chance of listing the person living in the very next room as a close friend. It's wild. Proximity was a massive predictor of friendship.
And this chart just shows you how dramatic the effect is. The chance of being friends plummets with just a few more steps down the hall. 4 doors away, the chance drops to just 10%. This is what psychologists call the mere exposure effect. The more we see someone, the more familiar and, well, likable they become. It's a fundamental piece of building any kind of connection.
But, and this is a huge but, it has to be done right. The source is really clear on this one. Creating proximity means, maybe joining the same club or finding natural reasons to be in the same place. It does not mean invading someone's space or privacy. You are not trying to cross that line. All right, get ready for a real psychological flip. You'd think that doing favors for someone is what makes them like you more, right? Well, the Ben Franklin effect suggests the opposite is actually even more powerful.
So this idea is based on a 1971 study where volunteers were put in charge. They had to instruct actors on how to do a task, and they were told to give one group positive encouragement and the other group negative criticism. But here's the twist. The real test subjects were the volunteers themselves.
So what happened? When the volunteers rated the actors afterward, they consistently said the people they had encouraged were more attractive and likable. It's our brain trying to justify our own actions. We think, hey, I was nice to that person, so I must like them. We actually change our feelings to match our behavior. So the practical move here is to flip the script. Instead of you doing all the favors, you create a small, easy opportunity for them to do a little favor for you. It could be as simple as asking for the time, asking for directions, or borrowing a pen. It triggers that same process in their brain. They think, I just helped this person, I must kind of like them. It's a subtle but really powerful shift. Okay, lesson 5. We have to talk about what most people assume is the #1 thing in attraction, appearance. But the research argues that what we think matters most, well, it might not be the whole story. So, this is the big question, right? Is attraction just about genetics?
We kind of assume you're either born with it or you're not. It's all about your bone structure, your genes. But the research tells a very different and honestly, a much more empowering story.
This quote comes from a 1997 study that surveyed college students. When they were asked to rate how attractive people were in photos, the things that stood out the most weren't the genetic features. They were things that signaled self-care, health, and just a positive vibe.
And this is the key. The things that have the biggest impact are the things we can actually control. It's not about winning some genetic lottery. The research shows it's about projecting health and confidence and self-respect through simple things like posture, grooming, and how you carry yourself.
Okay, but after all of that psychology, we've come to our final lesson. And the source argues that there are two biological factors that basically have veto power. They can override everything else we've just talked about.
The first factor is smell. Seriously, our noses can detect something called MHC molecules, which are tied to our immune system. In a super famous study, women were asked to smell t-shirts that different men had worn, and they overwhelmingly preferred the scent of men whose immune systems were the most different from their own. It's deep evolutionary instinct to find a mate who will produce healthier kids.
And the second biological veto? The first kiss. The source calls it a massive exchange of chemical and tactile information. And it is so critical that in one study, more than half of women said they completely lost their attraction to someone after a bad first kiss. It really is a make-or-break moment.
So where does all this leave us? On one hand, you've got all these psychological tools, scarcity, proximity, even asking for small favors that can genuinely shape attraction. There's so much we can control. But on the other hand, you have biology, this primal chemical connection that you just can't fake. Maybe the real art of attraction isn't about choosing one or the other. Maybe it's about understanding how to master the things you can control and knowing when to just let pure chemistry take the lead.